Welcome to Money Summit. My name is John Ogden, and we're here today with Tom Fishburne, a Marketoonist. Tom, we'd like to talk first about how financial services marketing has changed over the past 10 years.
I think a lot of it has come about just with the nature of technology changing, and there's been a responsiveness to that. So I feel like as all the trends come along that we've all noticed with mobile and social, et cetera, it's fundamentally changed how marketers in financial services think about marketing. The biggest shift is, if I put a headline to it, is the shift from a megaphone approach to marketing to one that's more conversation-based, where ultimately it's not the brands that are entirely control of the brand message, but the consumers actually have a voice in all of that.
Yeah.
And that's created a lot of challenges with brands as they try to adapt.
Good. So what do you think is the biggest thing that financial institution marketers should be doing that they're typically not doing?
I think with all the focus on tech, I think sometimes the shift has gone so much toward high scale, we've forgotten a little bit of the high touch.
Okay.
We had an experience recently in our own family where our daughters were old enough to have their own bank account, and we took them in for the bank account experience. And there's one bank that really focuses on that explicit use case of signing up somebody for their first account. And afterwards, our daughters had received handwritten notes from multiple people in the branch office thanking them for opening up an account there. And it left an impression with us.
Yeah.
And it's a bank that we normally, we just weren't really aware of, but we knew that they were focused on this use case. And to think of a handwritten thank you note as a potential disruptor feels a bit counterintuitive, as everyone's going to mobile and the most efficient ways to connect with audiences. But I feel like sometimes there's a bit of a herd mentality that people get so excited about the shiny new thing, they can sometimes forget about the fundamentals, so what's really meaningful to audiences.
Right. Yeah, so that people think, oh, it's technology, it's effective.
Yeah, right, exactly.
Might not always be the case.
Right. There's a shift I've seen Google talk about. They came out with a mobile report last year where they described something they refer to as micro moments that matter. What are the micro moments that matter to your audience, and how can you use technology to really connect with them in those micro moments? And I feel like often the technology gets applied with a pretty broad brush rather than thinking about what are the micro moments and then what is the technology that's now available that allows us to take greatest advantage of that. And in some cases, the best way to take advantage may be something as traditional as a handwritten thank you note. Or it may be something, with a mobile app that really makes it easy to do deposits. We still do work with a bank that has a limit on the value of deposits you can make with your mobile phone, which seems it's frustrating. And then other banks come along that think about that micro moment and the types of checks that we would deposit, and they think about that differently. And we now are in a place where the switching costs are getting lower, and it's much easier to think about financial services brands in terms of the needs of the moment. Google's big takeaway was that people are now more loyal to those needs in the moment than they are to any particular brand, which I think is really exciting.
I think so too. I like the micro moments because it gets to the experience and the emotion. It's grounding it in time and place. So you're thinking about what are they feeling right now, and kind of going through that as a marketer. So what would you say is the biggest obstacle that financial services marketers face when they're trying to implement these practices?
I'd say probably the biggest challenge has to do with compliance. How do we, as it goes from a megaphone where you control the message to one where you don't have as tight a control on the message, that's an uncomfortable place for any marketer. But in financial services, I mean, there are all sorts of regulatory and legal aspects to that, let alone, there's the brand police and how you want your brand to be perceived. And so I think that's a tough pendulum that's swinging, and managing that is a tricky one for marketers. And what I think it ultimately entails is engaging the broader organization to look at things not just from a compliance point of view, but also from a marketing point of view. I talked recently with a marketer at Axe, which is a consumer products brand. They do edgy marketing, but they're also within Unilever. They're one of the billion-dollar brands within Unilever. So Unilever protects brands like that pretty carefully. And I asked him, how do you get away with some of the edgy stuff that you do? How do you get that past legal, quote unquote? And I had a cartoon I showed today that had some marketers standing in front of a billboard. It's a completely blank billboard, and they're saying this was our compromise with legal. And his answer was that rather than do what a lot of marketers do, where you have a marketing execution that's fully baked and ready to go, you bring it to the legal team, and their only recourse is to take out a big red pen and say what you can't say. They came to them with edgy ideas at the real early stages and actually asked the lawyers to put on their creative hats and say, how far would you take this idea? And
so
some of their
training, like we're going to train the lawyers
to think like marketers.
To think like us.
Yeah, and they were actually caught off guard. They weren't used to that, but they got really excited about it and embraced it. And some of their edgiest campaigns ended up coming from the lawyers because they were wearing a creative hat rather than just a compliance hat.
That's good. I was really intrigued, speaking about your speech that you just gave, with the story of a woman who was excited about Nutella.
Yeah.
And she kept promoting Nutella, and she created a Nutella World Day. Is that what it was?
She created her own holiday, World Nutella Day.
World Nutella Day. So that's an interesting scenario. Sorry, that's an interesting scenario for banks to wrestle with. What if you have somebody who is doing this, and you're trying to navigate through wanting to embrace this activity and compliance?
Yes.
What would you say about that?
Well, I recognize how extremely complicated there is, and there isn't a one-size-fits-all playbook. But I think the fundamental lesson for marketers, and it's going to continue to be awkward. I described it as the awkward adolescent stage of digital marketing. But I think that the rule of thumb should be in any marketing execution to ask, is it worth sharing? Is it something that the Sarah Rosso of the world for your institution? There are certain things that you can't have them say within your brand and your portfolio, or if it makes it look like you're endorsing certain things. But the question is, for those people who are out there like that, and they may have small platforms or large platforms, are you fundamentally as marketers engaging them in a way and giving them something that's fundamentally worth sharing? Are you seeing them as a potential ally of your brand rather than as a threat to put a wet blanket over? And that's the challenge, I think. And again, it's not easy, but I think we'll see a lot of brands experiment more and more with that. And the most important thing is that within the organization, it can't be a siloed approach. You have to have, the easiest thing to do is just say no. The siloed approach turns into that as the path of least resistance. What we have to do as marketers is have courage and encourage the broader organization to develop a framework that works. I've heard described as freedom within a framework. You develop a framework that's expansive enough that lets you do what you need to do, and you develop that framework collaboratively so you tick the boxes, but you develop that framework with a mindset to ultimately do what everybody wants, which is to be a financial services brand that really resonates and takes advantage of the shift that's happening, whether the brand's on board or not at the end of the day.
It kind of opens up the possibility of failure, which I think a lot of people see as scary, right?
Yes.
But without that risk, you're not going to be notable.
Right. And I think there's the possibility to frame failure in tiny boxes, to have failure that can be somewhat self-contained and basically lower the risk of failure so that you can learn from that and then excel at that.
Interesting. That's an example of that.
Well, one that I shared today, actually, a clothing company called Beta Brand. They launch clothing. They compete against bigger brands, and they launch a new article of clothing every week. You could think that type of model would be a colossal nightmare. You'd end up with warehouses filled with inventory. But they decided to frame it so that they're able to make the clothing basically on demand. So they'll come up with a concept each week, a new creative concept, whether it's pants made out of disco ball material or whatever. And then they'll see the demand, and they'll basically make up to that demand. And some ideas go by the wayside. Some ideas are tremendously successful, and they build on that as a platform, but they did it in such a way. We often hear of tech companies doing that, where they fail small. They're living sort of always in beta, but that's an example of a physical goods company that's able to approach that mentality. And I think that always in beta mindset could apply to financial services too, and keeping it contained, making the framework again, and the stakes lower, small scale trials.
So they can see the demand via their digital portal.
Yes.
They can say, 8 people want these pants.
Exactly.
We'll go ahead and do it for 8 people.
Right. Yeah.
And if they fail,
They made that, and they said they've never lost money on a single new product introduction, which is crazy for consumer products.
Yeah, that's crazy.
But they launched something like they launched the gluttony pants, which were a pair of pants around Thanksgiving with an extra button to make more room for the meal. That did really well, so they launched an article of clothes for each of the 7 deadly sins, and that all became great stories, and they expanded upon that.
Yeah.
Other things didn't go so well, and they let that go by the wayside. But they built that mentality, that always in beta philosophy, into their organization. And that obviously with compliance is a different story in financial institutions, but I think some form of that is still possible.
Yeah. It's not as scary if you realize the failure is going to pinch rather than devastate the company, right?
Yes, exactly. You could do it with a small subset of an audience. You could do it within one store environment. You could do, or like a retail branch environment. You can do small scale trials and then build on that. And I think we live in a world where so much is happening in fintech that a lot of other organizations, not traditionally in financial services, are going to be pushing some of those envelopes that traditional players aren't as comfortable pushing. So I feel like that's a tough one to watch too. And what it requires is for every brand, whether you're large, small, been around for a long time, or you're a relatively new entrant, every brand has to fundamentally think like a challenger. How would you challenge the way things have always done? And by thinking like a challenger, you can take advantage of some of the change that's happening.
Yeah, that's interesting. So you can use the fintech partnership as sort of a way to experiment.
Yes.
Right. Where you guys can iterate as partners, and that isn't the nerve. It's not so close to the nerves for the financial institution, right?
That's right. Exactly.
So, interesting. So let's conclude by talking about the future. So I would say a lot of changes have happened in marketing over the past 10 years. What's the biggest thing that financial institution marketers need to keep their eye on kind of going forward the next 10 years?
I feel like a lot of it, in my view, is going to be a little bit less about the shiny new thing that comes along every week, and more about the fundamentals of making sure that you have a platform so that when the new thing comes along, next year's South by Southwest and everybody's buzzing about something, that it's not just about that technology, but it's really how do you get the most advantage of that technology using the philosophy you've already built into your brand. So this last South by Southwest was all about virtual reality. I'm sure in some form virtual reality will touch financial services. Who knows what it will look like. But the first executions at South by Southwest were basically just about that technology. You could walk into a giant Happy Meal box and see this Happy Meal box. That's not going to be how people want to engage with McDonald's. That's an example of people saying, here's the shiny new thing, let's create something around that. And I think for financial services, it's going to be less about the shiny new thing and more about how do we, going back to the micro moments that matter, how do we really understand our customer, which we need to be doing anyway, how do we really understand these micro moments, and how do we always have an eye for new technology that will allow us to do that job well. Whether it's, again, going back to the handwritten thank you notes or the virtual reality of the future. Ultimately, it's not putting the cart before the horse.
Thanks so much for joining us today.
Yeah, thank you for having me.